Craven's New Nightmare, a novel by David Bergantino, Chapter 7. The sounds of murder shattered the tension in the dispensary. The guards took off toward the commotion immediately, leaving Heather alone with Dr. Hefner. Rising swiftly to her feet, Heather still expected the doctor to try stopping her, but Dr. Hefner didn't even blink. Her features were frozen in place, her face a mask of terror. Heather hurried out of the room before the doctor could come to her senses. Heather arrived at the examination room moments after the guards. By now the screaming had subsided, replaced by deep sobbing and sounds of retching. A nurse staggered out of the room. One guard tried to push past her, but she held him back. "Forget it," she said, barely able to speak. "Nothing you can do in there. Call the cops, now." The terror in her expression convinced the guards to go no farther. They turned abruptly and ran down the hall. As Heather approached, the lead nurse staggered away after the guards. Others came stumbling through the doorway. They did not try to stop Heather from entering the room. It was taking all their strength simply to keep from screaming. When Heather looked in, she saw why. Blood was everywhere. Heather followed the trail of blood with her eyes. The smear went up the wall and across the ceiling. Heather's terror deepened when she realized it was a chilling duplication of the scene in the first Elm Street in which Tina was murdered. Blood dripped from the ceiling and landed on the surface of the examination table with a rhythmic metallic splat. Behind the table lay Julie. Her eyes were wide with terror, the violence of her death evident in her expression. Heather turned from the sight. The door suddenly seemed miles away. Her mind was overloading, shutting down. Then a thought broke through the fuzz. Dylan was not in the room. She staggered for the door and somehow made it to the hallway without passing out. One nurse remained leaning against a wall. She was dazedly rubbing a purple bruise that swelled from her cheekbone. "My son?" Heather asked her. "Did you see my son?" At first the nurse didn't seem to understand the question. Then the words sank in and she spoke haltingly. I thought he was here. I thought..." She trailed off, rubbing her bruise with one hand, pointing vaguely with the other. Footsteps approached from behind Heather. She turned to find Dr. Hefner stumbling from the dispensary like a malfunctioning automation. The paralysis had broken, but her mind was still reeling with sudden loss of control of the situation. "No way he's going anywhere," she insisted desperately. Her voice had a crazed edge. "He's been well sedated." "He doesn't have to be awake to be on his feet," Heather told her. If she could get the doctor to snap out of it, she might be willing to help. "What?" asked Dr. Hefner. She only blinked at Heather, utterly without comprehension. "He sleepwalks, you idiot!" Heather yelled, wanting to shake the doctor until she broke. "He's fully capable of walking out of this hospital." Then she stopped, realizing, "Oh my God, he thinks I've gone home?" Without another word, she spun around and ran off, leaving Dr. Hefner to stare dumbly at the place she had been standing. The Los Angeles Times, March 22, 1993, page 5A. Hospital Attack Leaves One Dead, by Kevin Levant. In the early morning hours, an unidentified woman died at St. Joseph's Valley Hospital. The causes were not natural, nor due to illness. In fact, she wasn't even a patient. Instead, the woman died of multiple stab wounds inflicted during a knife attack while she visited the sick child of a friend. The Los Angeles Times has learned that the attack took place behind a locked door and that the assailant escaped without even being seen. The only possible witnesses was the child the woman was visiting. But somehow he disappeared in the confusion following the discovery of the woman's body. A major lawsuit seems likely as the hospital is forced to answer questions regarding the competence of its security force. Some patients are transferring to different hospitals, saying they no longer feel safe at St. Joseph's. A hospital spokesperson had no comment on the incident, except to say that it was a tragedy and that a full investigation into the matter will commence immediately. Los Angeles Times, September 27, 1993. Page 14A. Distraught doctor kills self and dog. The body of Dr. Carla Harker, former director of pediatric medicine at St. Joseph's Valley Hospital, was found today in the front seat of her car, parked in the garage of her Beverly Hills home. Beside her was the body of her Welsh corgi, Brat. According to the coroner, the bodies had been there for at least 2 days. The engine of the car had been left running, flooding the garage with exhaust fumes. Both Dr. Harker and her dog died of carbon monoxide poisoning. The doctor's death has been ruled a suicide. Friends of Dr. Harker say that she had been despondent since being forced to resign from her post at St. Joseph's following the investigation of the murder of a visitor 6 months ago. At the time, there were unconfirmed reports of irregularities in the doctor's performance of her duties the night of the incident. No charges were ever filed against her. The entire case has been sealed by the police, and the hospital, through its spokesperson, has repeatedly refused comment. Dr. Harker will be buried, along with her pet, after private services to be held later this week. She was unmarried and had no children. Relatives have asked that in lieu of flowers, donations be made to the ASPCA.
From the Journal of David Bergantino, June 27, 1994. Waiting for Laurel to return my call. Left an urgent message. Got restless waiting, so I went back to the library one more time. One more look into Pandora's box. At least Dr. Harker/Hefner was lucky. Freddy didn't get her. But was she really that distraught? Or was she just trying to beat Freddy to the punch? Something for me to think about while I wait for a callback.
Heather reached the ground level of the hospital after nearly leaping down 3 flights of stairs. Pandemonium was breaking loose in the front lobby as the police arrived. One of Dr. Hefner's guards yelled for her to stop, but Heather ignored him. She had to find Dylan. Once outside, she found her car, gunned the engine, and tore out of the hospital parking lot, nearly colliding with several cars. As she raced home, Heather realized that she didn't know exactly where Dylan could be. He might even return to the hospital. If so, someone needed to be there and keep Dr. Hefner away from him. With Wes riding and Robert either missing or out of town, there was only one person she could turn to. She punched John Saxon's number into her car phone and prayed for him to answer. The phone was picked up, dropped, then a deep, sleepy voice answered. "John Saxon, do you have any idea what time it is?" "John, it's Heather. I need help." "You got it," he answered, instantly alert. "What's happening?" "Dylan's run away from the hospital." Heather scanned the streets as she talked. She was fighting to maintain control of both the car and herself. "I don't know whether he's wandering around or heading for the house, but I think Freddy's after him. I know it sounds crazy." "You're right. That sounds crazy," he said, but he was not judging, just listening. "John, will you please just look for him around the hospital? I'm going to go right to the house." She felt the tears coming, and if they did, she could not stop them. "Will you help me, John? Please?" He didn't answer immediately. For a moment, she thought he had hung up. If he abandoned her, she would be left with no one. "I'm on my way," he said finally. "You go home, Heather. That's the smart thing to do. I'll call you there." His tone gave no doubt of his unquestioning support. Now she began to cry, but with the influx of relief came more fear. "Thank you, John. I'll never forget." A terrifying sight through her windshield cut her off. She slammed on the brakes and the car screeched to a stop. Across the street, a tiny figure was climbing the embankment that bordered the freeway. It was Dylan. Soon he stood at the edge of the freeway, lit by the glare of 1,000 headlights. Wind whipped his hair and clothes as he strained forward, staring across 8 lanes of high-speed traffic, trying to see his home. Heather leaped out of the car as Dylan began to climb the guardrail. "Dylan!" she screamed. She had little hope that he could hear her over the roar of cars and trucks, but he stopped climbing the guardrail and turned. Dylan thought he heard his mother calling from somewhere below. At least it sounded like her, but it could also be the mean man playing a trick. He knew what the mean man could do. Dylan didn't know how long she had been gone, or whether there had been time for her to get Rex and start back to the hospital. He looked down past the shrub that covered the embankment and saw her. It was his mother, his real mother. The mean man couldn't fool him that much, even from this far away. "Dylan, stay right there!" she called, so he stayed put. As she scrambled up the embankment, the clouds began to move in the sky. Dylan looked up and saw him. The mean man, his mother, called Freddy. He was made of clouds and his eyes were 2 rotten moons. The wide brim of his felt hat almost blotted out the real moon. Then Dylan saw the steel claws, the one that had hurt Rex and Julie. Only now they were huge, each one long enough to skewer him lengthwise. As they passed through the sky, the razors left gashes in the sky itself. The moonlight shined off them as they reached down. If he ran to his mother, Freddy would have him. As Heather fought her way up the hill, she saw Dylan suddenly look upward. She stopped and followed his gaze, but saw nothing. By the time she looked back, Dylan was scrambling over the guardrail. Then, without a moment's hesitation, he ran right onto the freeway and disappeared from view. As fast as she could, she clawed her way up the embankment. Car horns blared and wheels screeched above her, but she heard no sounds of impact. An 18-wheeler screamed by as she reached the guardrail, the rush of air nearly sending her tumbling back down the embankment. She could see Dylan now, between the first 2 lanes. His face looked blank and terrified all at the same time. He ambled in circles, looking at the sky all the while. Suddenly his body was glowing in the light of an oncoming car. Heather screamed as the car swerved out of the way just in time. Cars roared by on either side. He was trapped. Then the impossible happened. Dylan abruptly rose in the air several feet. As Heather watched, he was set down again in the path of a large flatbed truck. Dylan appeared to be struggling with something invisible. Just when a collision seemed unavoidable, he flew into the air again, and the truck rushed by. He landed 20 feet away in the path of a Jeep. Again, Dylan was lifted away at the last possible moment. Heather could only watch helplessly as Dylan was tossed mercilessly from one near collision to the next. But her terror turned to anger at the sight of her son being used for sport. "Freddy!" she yelled into the empty sky. "You bastard! Take me!" She ran onto the freeway. Freddy had caught up to Dylan in the middle of the freeway and snagged his shirt on one gleaming claw. He dangled there, helpless as Freddy threw him from place to place on the freeway. The boy tried to close his eyes, but the scarred face was still visible in the dark of his mind. Even the prospect of being hit by a car was not as frightening as the mean man's evil leer blazing in his head. His mother's shouting made him open his eyes again. He could see her running toward him, waving her arms. She didn't see the cylindrical truck, a tanker truck his father used to call them, bearing down on her, but the driver saw his mother and slammed on his brakes. The screech of the truck as it slid forward drowned out all other sounds. The tanker then twisted sideways and swept toward his mother like a wall across 3 lanes. She seemed to be frozen in place. Dylan screamed for his mother to run, and finally she did. Only there was nowhere to go. She dived to the ground as the rear of the truck slid over her. Dylan was certain she had been crushed. The part of him that Freddy had touched and made to grow old wished God had taken him in the playground that day. The tanker came to a halt far past his mother's body. She was motionless, but he saw no blood around her like he had expected. Then she sat up, dazed but otherwise unhurt. It took him a moment to realize the truck's undercarriage had been high enough to pass over his mother without touching her. The shock and relief almost made him forget that any moment now Freddy might not lift him out of the way of some onrushing vehicle. Then the blade holding him sliced through his shirt. He dropped like a pebble on the surface of the freeway. Headlights caught him immediately. In a desperate leap, he made it to the median strip just as the car shot past. The fence was too high for him to climb, but he found a hole and crawled through to the other side of the freeway. He looked back and saw his mother dodging a station wagon that bore down on her. Another car caught her unaware and hit her head on as it tried to stop. She was sent flying through the air and landed on her back 30 feet away. Dylan yelled, but no one could hear. He waited, but she didn't get back up again. The traffic was finally beginning to stop, and several drivers left their cars to help. He wanted to go back, but Freddy was looking down at him again. Reluctantly, he turned and started across the other half of the freeway. Traffic was lighter on this side, but cars still whizzed by dangerously. He looked up to see if Freddy was reaching for him again, but saw only clouds and the moon. Just like that, the mean man was gone. This was his chance to return to his mother. But when he turned back, Freddy was there, in force. Thousands of Freddys all peered over the median strip at him. Then they began to pour over the fence like invading soldiers. Only one thing can help me now, Dylan thought. He turned and darted safely across the final 2 lanes, hopped over the guardrail and tumbled down the embankment. When he stopped tumbling, he was dizzy and scratched but safe. He was across the freeway. Home was not far away, and Rex was waiting. Heather regained consciousness just as Dylan was fleeing the horde of Freddys. At first she didn't remember what had happened or where she was. A crowd of people surrounded her. They were talking, but their words were meaningless. The ground was hard and gritty. Peering past the legs of those standing over her, she saw she was on the highway. Then she heard squealing brakes and screaming car horns. Dylan had been crossing the freeway and must now be on the other side of the median strip, she realized. She tried to stand. Instantly she felt a sharp pain in her side. Gritting her teeth against it, she struggled to her feet. The voices were understandable now. They were telling her to hold still, wait for the ambulance. She pushed away the hands that sought to restrain her, and staggered away from the crowd. Many were too shocked that she was even moving to think of stopping her. At the median strip, Heather laboriously pulled herself over the fence. Rubberneckers were slowing traffic on this side, so she was able to make it across the 4 lanes without being struck. When she got to the top of the opposite embankment, its steepness was dizzying. There was no way to get down without falling, especially in her condition. So she went limp and allowed herself to roll down the hill. When her equilibrium returned, she brought herself painfully to her feet and headed for home. Away from the freeway, the streets were peaceful and still. The sounds of her own body flooded her ears. Joints cracked and blood pounded in her ears. Her own breath roared in her head like Freddy's furnaces. Bruises and scratches covered most of her exposed body. Blood stained her clothing. The faintest grinding sound accompanied the sharp pain in her side, suggesting a broken rib. But I'm alive, she thought. Freddy hasn't won yet. Her house finally appeared up the street. She quickened her pace as much as possible and started up the walk, then stopped. The front door stood open as if the house were waiting for her. The possibility of a trap briefly crossed her mind. Her desperation to find Dylan was making her careless, she knew. But so be it. Heather entered the house. The living room was empty and silent. "Dylan!" she called. He did not answer. Then a shadow moved in the kitchen, a big one. The figure of a man appeared in silhouette. She screamed and shrank back, certain that Freddy had come for her. "Holy," said a familiar voice from the kitchen. John Saxon emerged wearing new sweats. He appeared almost as shocked as she was. Heather would have laughed if she weren't so panicked. "Where's Dylan? Have you seen him?" The memory that John was supposed to be at the hospital floated up, but she pushed it away. "Relax, Nancy. Relax," he said, gesturing for her to calm down. Then he pointed toward the stairs, but she didn't look immediately. Did he call me Nancy? She wondered, unsure of her perceptions. His eyes revealed nothing out of the ordinary, just concern. Finally, she looked to where he was pointing. Dylan stood at the bottom of the stairs, clutching Rex. His eyes were open, but he was obviously still in a deep sleep. His lips were moving, and it took her a moment to realize he was singing softly. He just repeated the words over and over like a needle was skipping in his head. The eerie quality of his voice was chilling, but it didn't keep her from running over to him and hugging him so hard that John raced over to make sure she wasn't hurting him. "What in the world's happened?" he asked. Heather thought he deserved an explanation, no matter how crazy it might sound. So much had happened by now that was outside of her head. Julie's death was not just a paranoid delusion. The nurses had seen something horrifying and unforgettable. And it only took one look at Dylan to know that something very out of the ordinary was happening. She held Dylan tight and began to explain. "I know how Chase really died," she said, her voice quivering. "What are you talking about?" John's eyes narrowed suspiciously. Heather got the strange feeling he was expecting her to lie. She ignored the feeling and pushed on. It might be difficult for him to understand, but at least he would consider it. "Fred Krueger did it." In response, John did the most peculiar thing. He rolled his eyes at her, as if she was pulling his leg. "Yeah, right." Then he crossed his arms as if daring her to come up with a better story. Heather was shocked. For a moment she didn't know what to say. She expected a little more sympathy from her friend, even if it did sound crazy. But he was rejecting the notion out of hand. It was singularly unlike John. "You saw him, didn't you? Dylan!" It seemed a desperate move, but it was all she could come up with. Dylan's only answer was to sing more of the song. "Coming for you," he chanted. Whatever his eyes were seeing, it was not this room. John tugged gently on her sleeve. Concern and regret showed on his face now. Perhaps he was sorry for the way he was treating her, but Heather still couldn't shake the feeling that there was something peculiar about him. "Hey, come outside a minute. I need to talk to you." He took her by the arm and began to march her to the front door. She tried to turn away, but though he held her gently, his grip was firm. He wouldn't let go. Just before they went through the door, she saw that Dylan had started sucking his thumb. He turned and began to walk slowly up the stairs to his bedroom. "Dylan!" she yelled, but he was oblivious. "Jesus!" said John, as Dylan climbed out of sight. "What the hell's going on, Nancy?" Heather spun around as if John had slapped her. While she stared, he led her out onto the front step. Just past the threshold, a wave of vertigo hit her. At first, she thought she was going to pass out, but it wasn't that kind of sensation. It was more a feeling of dislocation. But even that wasn't as disturbing as how John was acting. "John, why are you calling me Nancy?" "Why are you calling me John?" he shot back. Again the harsh look while he waited for her to explain herself. The vertigo surged again, and she looked around. Red light reflected off the white of the doorframe, and she spun back to face John. Only he wasn't John anymore. He'd become Lieutenant Thompson, her father in the first Elm Street movie. The sweats were gone, replaced by a sheriff's uniform and a heavy bomber jacket. Behind him on the curb sat an exact replica of his car from the movie. The red beam from the magnetic dome light lanced out into the night. Lieutenant Thompson was fiddling with the brim of his sheriff's hat. "Nancy," he said, this time making her jump. "You gotta get a hold of yourself before you make both yourself and that kid nuts." Heather blinked a few times. But the illusion did not go away. Apparently, Freddy was so close to breaking free. His presence was influencing her reality. But he couldn't cross over, not while she was still alive. And she was not only alive, but ready to fight him. Heather steadied herself and looked right at Lieutenant Thompson, hoping to see past the illusion to the real John Saxon she thought might be underneath. "John," she said deliberately. Upon hearing his name, a look of pain and confusion swept across his face. She thought, hoped, that she was getting through whatever unreal barrier was between them. If she could remind him who he really was, perhaps he could fight Freddy too. Then she asked him, just as deliberately, "Would you call Roberts?" He just stared. "Roberts?" he asked slowly. She thought she saw recognition flickering just below the surface of his expression. "Robert Englund," she continued, trying to poke a hole back into reality. "You know, the actor who plays Freddy." "Freddy who?" he asked, instantly agitated. I'm close now, she thought, very close. "You know who. Freddy Krueger." The name hit him like a painful blow. He turned away and then back again quickly. His face turned bright red, and she could see he was struggling. She reached out her hand, hoping that actually touching him would help. "Freddy's dead, Nancy," he said suddenly. "Now don't lose it like your mother." Heather recoiled. She had failed. Freddy's strength was too great for her to wrestle reality away from him. Before she knew what was happening, he was hugging her, rocking her like she was his little girl. When he let go, there were tears in his eyes. All at once she knew exactly what he was thinking. Lieutenant Thompson thought he had made the mistake of mentioning her mother. She had died at the end of the first movie, and the subject would be a sore spot between them. "I love you, sweetheart. Don't you ever forget that." He brushed away a lock of hair that had fallen into her face and turned away. As he got into his police cruiser, there was only one thing for her to say. "I love you too, Daddy." The moment she said that, she could feel Freddy starting to push through into the world. In her mind, she saw him rising from the space beyond the bottom of Dylan's bed. As the blankets stretched around him, the claw slashed through. Soon they dropped away, revealing a hulking silhouette of evil. The impression was burning into her mind. But an invisible membrane, invulnerable to his lethal claw, kept him from coming any farther. The gate was still closed, and she was its keeper. Only her death would open it. Until then, he could play his tricks, but could not pass through. "Now get yourself some rest, Nancy, please," said Lieutenant Thompson from the car. He didn't wait for a reply before he started the engine, turned on the siren, and roared off into the night. Then everything changed. Heather's front yard was no longer hers. It became Nancy's. She looked down to find herself dressed in pajamas. Turning, she saw that she now stood in front of the fictional house of the Elm Street movies. Barred windows gave it a blind expression, but it seemed that the house recognized her. The front door swung wildly on its hinges as the wind began to pick up. It howled through the trees as it had a few nights before. Heather was at the crossroads. The time had come to make her choice. She could reject the challenge if she wanted, but she had no idea what the consequences of doing so might be. She realized that the possibilities were so horrifying that her mind could not, would not comprehend them. All of life, and not just for her, would become a nightmare. To stop now would mean turning her back on Chase and Dylan and Julie. That notion was even further beyond comprehension. She started into Nancy's house. Her house.
From the Journal of David Bergantino, June 28, 1994. Laurel never returned any of my calls, so I went over to the office. I wanted to know about Jason LaCroix. The first thing I saw was the dark circles under her eyes. Initially, she wouldn't talk to me, even yelled at me to get out of her office. But I didn't. Finally, she fessed up. I was one of 3 people who were hired to write the book. They, the movie people, the publisher, the agency, figured that between the 3 writers, someone would complete the book. Complete the book or what? I asked. Before Freddy offed us? Because the movie hadn't been quite enough and you needed a book as the final nail in his coffin? You're crazy, she yelled. You ought to be put away. Okay, I answered. So have me put away. Fire me. All she said was, I can't. It was because I was the last one left. She didn't have to say it. Then she wouldn't even look at me. I demanded to know who the third writer was, but she said it didn't matter, especially not now. When I asked what happened to him, she just looked at me and said, I don't know. I believed her. I also believed that she didn't want to know. The sadness and fear in her face suddenly became unbearable, so I left. So here I am, about to pull the all-nighter of my life, and Jason LaCroix's, and that of the third unknown writer. If I can finish the book tonight, I might yet survive this job, because finishing the book is the only way to put Freddy away for good. And I just have to make sure I don't fall asleep. And I won't. I got lots of coffee.
Dylan's scream echoed down the stairs just as Heather entered the house. She turned toward the sound and his voice was abruptly cut off. Before she could react, the front door slammed shut behind her with a metallic clang. She saw that it had been reinforced with steel. And now it was locked as well. She was trapped. Oddly enough, though the windows were still barred on the outside, the interior of the house was still hers. "Dylan?" she called up the stairway, but there was no answer. Going into the kitchen, she armed herself with the largest butcher knife she could find. She wasn't sure if it would be effective against Freddy, but it was her only weapon. The sound of her own voice emanating from the living room caused her to turn. The television was on, playing the final scene from A Nightmare on Elm Street.
I'm gonna go and get the guy who did it. And I want you to be there to arrest him when I bring him out, okay?
Nancy, just tell me who did it. I'll go get him, baby.
Fred Krueger did it, Daddy.
Yeah, sure.
Then the television winked off. Heather knew there was no turning back now. She would find Dylan and bring him back from whatever Freddy had taken him to. As she approached the stairs, she noticed several small white dots on the carpet, leading up into the darkness. One lay near her feet. She stooped down and picked up a tiny capsule. "Dylan's sleeping pills," she said out loud. She followed the trail, picking up capsules along the way. They led into Dylan's room. Holding the knife in front of her, she reached inside and switched on the light. The room was empty, save for 2 more pills, and the disemboweled remains of Rex at the foot of the bed. As she approached Rex, she noticed another pill on the blankets of Dylan's bed, near the pillows. She picked up the last pill and kept it with the rest in her hand. Now what, she thought. Then, on an impulse, she lifted the blanket. Just below the pillow sat another pill. Lifting the blanket further up, she saw yet another. Grabbing that one, she pulled off the blanket entirely, uncovering the danger area at the foot of the bed. She could see only the bed and the floor beyond. No more sleeping pills. She knew that somehow Freddy had taken Dylan to his side of the gate. "I may be the guard," she thought, "but I have no key. I can't go through any more than he can." Dropping the blankets back onto the bed, she sat down trying to think. She could feel despair growing again, but despair feeds on hope to make room for itself in the soul. That meant there's still hope, Heather thought. I'm not beaten yet. I just have to try harder to figure it out. A minute later, she realized that she held the key in her hand. "He's given me the only way I can join him," she told herself, staring at the sleeping capsules lying on her palm. "Must be 20 capsules at least," she thought skittishly. Before her nerve broke, she closed her eyes and took the sleeping pills. When she had finally swallowed them all, she opened her eyes again. So far, nothing had changed, and she briefly wondered if this wasn't a trick of Freddy's to kill her with a drug overdose. If so, it was too late now. She turned back to the bed and lifted the covers once more. Far underneath the blankets, a small white dot gleamed dimly at the foot of the bed. Another pill. Heather tucked her knife in her belt and crawled underneath the blankets toward the pill. To reach it, she had to wriggle under until the blankets covered her completely. The light shining through the blankets made them glow just enough for her to see. Then she had the pill and started backing out. It was getting very stuffy underneath the covers. Before she emerged back into the light, she stopped. Maybe, just maybe, there was one more pill. Crawling farther toward the foot of the bed, she lifted the blankets. She expected to uncover the foot of the bed. Instead, the sheets continued. And there, an impossible 6 feet away where the bed and the blanket met, sat another pill. When she reached it, she popped that capsule and the last one into her mouth and swallowed. Heather took a deep breath and pushed forward through the sheets. There could be one more sleeping pill, and each additional capsule would lead her closer to Dylan. With the next section of sheets she lifted, instead of another pill she uncovered infinity. The sheets drifted away and the slope of bedding dropped steeply down ahead of her. Beyond her was an eerie, horizonless twilight. Heather's mind began to shrink in the face of its vastness. Only the terrified sound of Dylan's voice reverberating from somewhere in that infinite blankness stopped her from crawling backward to escape. "Mommy!" Without thinking, Heather dived forward, flying out into the nothingness. The bedding soon disappeared as she tumbled down. At first, the featureless darkness gave her no sense of movement. Then far below emanated a red light as if from a great fire. It seemed she was floating down toward the light. Suddenly she became aware of wet stone walls on either side of her. Her mind lurched when she realized the incredible speed at which they shot by. With a bone-jarring impact, she unexpectedly hit bottom and shot forward, surrounded by water. An ancient aqueduct ejected her through a stony opening, and she was falling again. The blankness returned for a while, and all she could see below was a dark glimmer that looked like an angular black hole with teeth. She fell through the mouth, the remains of a medieval rotunda, and dropped directly into a deep reservoir. The stagnant water stopped her fall, but she was now in danger of drowning. Directions became meaningless. At first, she could only flail wildly about. Her oxygen-starved lungs were preparing to force her to breathe, but if she inhaled, only water would fill them. The slightest perception of up finally came to her, and she propelled herself in that direction. She broke the surface, gasping and half-drowned. Her hands found an edge to the reservoir, which she vaguely recognized as a catch basin for an enormous downspout, and pulled herself half out of the water. Something moved on the ground. Her shadow danced in a flickering red light that shined from behind her. Turning, she saw an enormous wall of furnaces, each roaring and belching out plumes of smoke and flame. As her eyes adjusted to the light, and she could make out the rest of her surroundings, her mind reeled. Galleries of stone, surreal structures of a nightmare city stretched out in all directions. They were huge, completely out of human scale. A constant rain fell from thick clouds of steam from the boilers. The proportions were staggering, the atmosphere oppressive, but worse yet, an intense evil pervaded everything. That alone threatened to snuff her determination to go on, but she would not leave without her son. "Dylan!" she yelled out, hoping to be heard over the roar of the furnaces. Her answer came almost instantly, the screeching of steel nails against steel, so piercing it seemed her head might shatter. When it ended, even the roaring flames seemed faint by comparison. She wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go, except toward the sound. As she dragged herself out of the basin, she could feel a tightness around her waist. Reaching down, she found the knife still tucked in her belt. Its familiarity was a greater comfort at the moment than its sharpness. She headed toward the furnaces, splashing through the cobblestone streets in the direction of the screeching. A vaulted arch appeared not far away, an opening into a cavernous room. The chamber glowed with the feverish light from the furnaces. "Mommy!" came the faintest sound at the far end of the chamber. In the distance, Dylan sat alone in front of a furnace, his body a tiny silhouette against the great wall of flame. He was looking down at something in his hands. As she neared, he stood and held out what appeared to be a stack of papers. The entire nightmare dimension became silent, as if holding its evil breath. Heather stopped short of him. She looked around, expecting a trap. "Dylan, "Where's the man?" "Here," he said, looking down at the papers. Heather didn't understand his meaning, but trap or not, she would be kept from him no longer. Running to him, she dropped the knife on the sill of the furnace before she lifted him into her arms. She hugged him close and covered him with kisses. Thank God, she prayed, he's safe. Dylan hugged her back, but his hand still clutched the stack of papers tightly. What is that?" she asked, afraid to know. He had said the man was there. By the look in his face, he didn't quite understand either, but he knew that somehow the man was continued in these pages. "A story?" he asked as she took the papers from him. Despite their immediate danger, Heather felt compelled to look. She saw at once that it was a script, Wes's script. She wondered where he was right now. "Yes," she told Dylan, "it's a story for a movie." "Read me some?" he asked. Heather was about to refuse when she realized that she had no idea how to return home. If this was the script, perhaps it held some clues. She began to read near the back, the accuracy of the words giving her an eerie feeling. "At last his mother finds him," she read. "She gives him a long, happy hug and then looks at the pages." "Story?" the little boy asks. "Yes," says his mother, "a story of us." And the mother takes the book and begins to read. That about brings us up to date, Heather thought, and looked at Dylan. His expression had become one of rapt attention. Apparently, in his desire to hear the story, he had forgotten where they were. For a moment, Heather forgot as well. Caught up in the absurdity of the situation, reading about her and Dylan, she laughed as she turned back to the script. "And as she began to read," she continued, "from behind her, there comes... Oh, shit. She turned around just as Freddy struck. He jerked her off her feet, lifted her into the air. At the same time, he snatched the script from her and flung it into the furnace. Dylan tumbled to the ground at Freddy's feet, momentarily forgotten. "Meet your maker!" Freddy bellowed, raising the claw. Heather struggled but knew she was about to die. Then Freddy was screaming, a terrifying, inhuman cry of pain. As he collapsed, she saw that Dylan had jammed the butcher knife into Freddy's knee. He released Heather and clawed at Dylan, barely missing as the boy jumped out of the way. Heather leaped on top of Freddy in an attempt to hold him down. "Run, Dylan!" she yelled, and he ran. Freddy twisted around before Heather could defend herself. Grabbing her by the throat, he flung her across the room, where she landed against a stone pillar. She dropped to the ruined floor unconscious. As Freddy pulled the blade from his leg, he spied Dylan disappearing through an archway. He flung the knife away and chased after the boy, anxious to end this battle. Once the boy was dead, his mother would have no power. He could dispatch her easily and then move on. Through the gate and into the world, as Freddy Krueger. In truth, he had no name, but his jailer, Wes Craven, had been correct. He enjoyed this particular persona. He found Freddy's particular evil gratifyingly savage. For ages, the taste of blood and terror had intoxicated him, and as Freddy, he became even more adept at satisfying the craving. As he chased the boy, he thought about his plans for the other side. His first order of business would be to find Craven. Freddy would meet his own maker, thank him for creating the perfect vessel, then gut him. With Craven dead, it would take at least another era for the world to produce a storyteller with the power to ensnare him again. Long before that could happen, Freddy intended to engulf the planet and its inhabitants with his evil until nothing good or innocent remained. But that would come later, after he killed this child. Dylan was just ahead now. The corridor they ran through led to a flight of stairs. At the top was a narrow room that ended in one of the gigantic furnaces that populated Freddy's dimension. Dylan came into view as Freddy mounted the stairs. The boy was cowering against a ledge beneath the furnace. He looked around desperately for a way to escape, but Freddy knew he was trapped. There was only one entrance to this room, and Freddy was now walking through it. He had toyed with the child on the freeway to lure his mother through the gate. Now he would end his life, and very painfully. Dylan soon realized the only place to go was into the furnace. Luckily, it was unlit. He scrambled up the ledge and disappeared into its gaping maw. Freddy flew at the furnace and reached in after him. The opening was too small for him to enter all at once, but if he pushed, Freddy could reach him with the claw. Dylan jumped over a giant pilot light just out of Freddy's reach. He was safe for now, but that wouldn't last long. Dylan had to find a way back out of the furnace. All that surrounded him, it seemed, were rusted iron walls coated with ashes. Freddy swiped again with the claw, coming so close this time. Dylan could feel the wind in his hair. He saw no way out. Realizing he was trapped, he began to scream for his mother. Dylan's screams wrenched Heather back to consciousness. It sounded as if he was calling from within a kettle drum. As she rushed to help Dylan, she found the knife in a puddle and stuck it back into her belt. High above, she saw Freddy, the top half of his body jammed in the opening of a large furnace. Dylan's screams came from inside, she realized. The fact that the furnace appeared to be cold gave her little comfort. Halfway up the stairs leading to the furnace room, the stone suddenly changed into a substance with the consistency of molasses. With each step, she sank deeper into the mire. The harder she fought against it, the stronger its hold on her became. This trick hadn't stopped Nancy in the first movie, she thought. It won't stop me now. With grim determination, she continued to climb the stairs. The mean man almost got him that time. Dylan tried to flatten himself against the back wall of the furnace, but Freddy kept squeezing forward. When his mother hadn't answered his screaming, he realized he was alone. Even Rex couldn't protect him now, so it was up to him to fight the bad man. He had an idea, but first he needed to get out of the furnace. Finally, he saw the way out. Above him, a hole no larger than his head led out of the furnace. It was his only chance. He jumped for the hole and caught the edge with both hands. Pulling himself up, he found he could just barely squeeze through. A sharp tug nearly ripped off his pajama shirt. Then he was being pulled backward. Freddy had hooked him with one claw. He tried to hold on, but it was no use. The mean man was much too strong for him, and he had to let go.
"Gonna eat you up,"
Freddy growled. Slowly, Dylan was being dragged toward Freddy's gaping mouth. It grew wider until his jaw unhinged like that of a snake, preparing to swallow a mouse. Dylan tried to crawl away, but Freddy had him. The demon's hot breath washed over him, only a few feet away now. Suddenly, Freddy dropped him and began screaming, infinitely more horribly than when Dylan had stabbed him in the knee. Dylan scrambled away and ran to the back wall. Soon he had climbed the wall and began squeezing out the small opening. Heather stood directly behind Freddy, the knife buried deep in his groin. If the ultimate evil of the universe is going to take the form of a man, that's his problem, she thought, and twisted the knife once more. Freddy's howling increased. He struggled to back out of the furnace, but he was stuck tight. Her trouble with the stairs had vanished just as she heard Dylan start screaming again. She figured that Freddy couldn't concentrate on too many manifestations at once, and she was able to climb the rest of the stairs easily. In his prone position, she had the choice between inflicting death or causing pain. She really didn't know if she could kill him, so she chose pain. By the sound of things, she had chosen well. Dylan emerged from a vent at the side of the furnace. Without a word, he joined her and started pushing Freddy back into the furnace. Heather got the idea and helped, using the knife handle for better leverage. In his pain and panic, Freddy stopped fighting and drew himself fully inside the furnace. Heather reached up and closed the door, swiftly bolting it shut. Freddy's deafening screams continued from within the furnace. She didn't know what to do next or how to get out of the nightmare world. The thought of being trapped here with Freddy mortified her. While she backed away in fear, Dylan scrambled up the side of the furnace. He climbed towards a large iron lever just above the door. He leaped out at the lever, grabbing hold and pulling down with all of his weight. There came a deep rumble, and all at once flames exploded inside the furnace. Dylan was thrown from the lever by the force of Freddy's renewed shrieking. The temperature in the chamber was rising rapidly. Heather grabbed Dylan and staggered away from the overheating furnace. She turned one last time to see an impossibly brilliant light blazing from the furnace, outshining the flames. She turned away before it could blind her. Then the horrible screams changed. She realized that Freddy was laughing as the fire consumed him. Then everything went white. Heather and Dylan fell out of the bed and onto the floor. She didn't know how they got there, only that they were home. She pulled the blankets off the bed and wrapped them around the two of them. Dylan struggled close and fell asleep almost immediately. Heather looked at the foot of the bed and that's all she saw, bed. Then she pulled down a couple of pillows and laid them on the floor. Out of the corner of her eye she saw the remains of Rex on the other side of the bed. He was beyond repair, another casualty. The sight of him torn to pieces saddened her almost as much as the thought of the human lives lost. That small stuffed animal had doubtlessly saved her son's life in the nightmare world. She was about to curl up against Dylan when she spied something on the floor underneath the foot of the bed. It was a stack of papers, loosely bound with 3 brads. She picked it up and opened it. The first page read, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, a film script by Wes Craven, starring Heather Langenkamp as herself, Robert Englund as himself. Then she flipped to the back page and read, Exhausted but alive despite their terrible ordeal, mother and son curl up against one another and sleep peacefully. Roll credits. The end. The Plain Dealer, Cleveland, Ohio, July 1st, 1994, page 1A. Los Angeles police seek clues in Cleveland man's disappearance. North Hollywood, California. Police responding to reports of screams and the sounds of a violent struggle discovered a grisly scene early Wednesday morning. They found the apartment of David Bergantino, formerly of Cleveland, Ohio, drenched in blood. Police are now seeking the 28-year-old writer for an explanation, but they are not very hopeful. We're pretty sure it's homicide, explained Officer Del Markey, but as of now we have no body, only all this blood, and if it's Mr. Bergantino's, well, that means whatever body we find won't have that much blood in it. In addition, the apartment was ransacked and all upholstery slashed with what police are speculating was a straight razor. According to friends and neighbors, Bergantino had been struggling to get his first big break in show business since his arrival in 1989. He was pretty quiet, except when he occasionally blasted Prince on his stereo, said one neighbor who requested anonymity. But he'd turn it down if you asked. Had a pretty bizarre sense of humor sometimes, but I liked him. Bergantino had recently completed work on a novel based on the latest installment of the popular horror movie series A Nightmare on Elm Street. A spokesperson for New Line Cinema, the film's producer, denied this was a publicity stunt to promote the book or the new movie. We don't need to play sick jokes to promote a film, especially an Elm Street movie, said the spokesperson. Friends of Bergantino, who asked not to be identified, told police that lately the writer had become moody and paranoid. Something was going on, but he wouldn't talk about it, confided one, which wasn't like him. Usually you couldn't get him to shut up about himself. Bergantino's friends fear the worst. Police ask anyone with information regarding this case to call their Crime Stopper number, toll free, at 1-800-555-4689. All calls will be kept confidential. Editor's note, October 1st, 1994. This book was published using materials found in the author's apartment after his disappearance. These include his original manuscript and news clippings. Entries from the author's personal journal were not originally intended for publication.
From the Journal of David Bergantino, May 5th, 1994. My agent called. I got the job! Today I start work on the official novelization of Wes Craven's New Nightmare. I'm gonna be published! Insert small victory dance here. Of course, my parents first asked if I got that in writing. Then they gushed about how happy they were. Whatever. But this is where it all begins.
Okay, Slashaholics, this has been the novel Wes Craven's New Nightmare by David Bergantino. I hope you guys have enjoyed this novelization as much as I did. I had a lot of fun putting this one together. Having David on board to do the journal entries was awesome. We had Dino from the Dino and Ted show doing some of the news report from the scrapbook clippings. Thank you, Dino, for doing that, and thank you, David, for helping out with the journal entries. As I've said before, I'm going to do a separate video where I'm going to do a review on this book and the movie together. I'm going to be putting that out in the next week or two, so keep an eye out for that. Got some fun stuff planned for that. So I'm going to keep it short and simple here, guys. That I had fun recording this book. It's one of my favorite Freddy movies. I can tell a lot of differences. Maybe the script, they ended up using in the movie was a bit different than what was given. But all in all, great book, great movie. Have no complaints about either one of them. And like I said, it was a blast putting this one together. Hope you guys all enjoyed it. If you're listening to the unabridged version of this book, then stay tuned, because coming up right after I get through running my mouth, you get to hear some question and answers from the author himself, David Bergantino. I supplied some questions, and a few subscribers sent in some questions, and he's going to answer them here at the end of the video. Chapter 7 and the unabridged version of this book has been brought to you by the patrons on Patreon. Carl Eakins, Catherine McClear, Sean Campbell, and Cecilia Spears. Thank you guys so much. And if anybody else would like to sponsor the channel for as low as $2 per month and get some great rewards for doing so, check out the link in the description for the Patreon page. Alright guys, if you're listening to the unabridged version of this, then stick around for the Q&A coming up right now. If you're listening to just the Chapter 7 upload, come back and check out when the unabridged version drops for the Q&A with David Bergantino. And until next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, keep it scary, and
Pleasant screams!